She was just a small orphan girl living alone by the river. But what she did for a limping stranger that night would bring 30 armed warriors to her doorstep by dawn and change both their worlds forever. The child's cries echoed across the riverbank as the evening deepened and shadows thickened beneath the trees. Clementine Shaw, only 8 years old, dropped the armful of firewood she'd been collecting and ran toward the sound without hesitation. Through the silver mist curling over the water, she saw her, a girl about her own age, waist deep in the shallows, struggling fiercely against the current. One leg hung at an unnatural angle, and every time she tried to rise, the rushing water dragged her down again. Any other frontier child might have turned and run. Most would have sprinted back to their homes, back to the protection of family and firelight. But Clementine had no one to run to. The tiny log cabin behind her was silent now, holding only the fading presence of her grandmother, who'd passed 3 months earlier and left the girl alone in this remote stretch of river country. Maybe that's what made her brave. Loneliness has a strange way of turning into courage when there's no one else left to act. The native girl's dark hair was plastered to her cheeks, and her eyes were wide with pain and panic. She was trying, desperately, to crawl toward the opposite bank, but her leg gave out every time she put pressure on it. As she struggled, her eyes met Clementine's across the widening current. For a long moment, the two girls just stared, one drowning, one frozen, two children from worlds meant to fear each other. Clementine had heard the whispers in town, stories of raids, children taken from their beds in the dark, warnings muttered about the tribes who lived beyond the borders of the white settlements. Her grandmother had always told her to stay away from them, to be wary of anything unfamiliar in the woods. But in front of her now was no story, no threat, just a wounded child gasping for help. And Clementine didn't hesitate. She stepped into the river, and the cold struck her like a slap. The current snatched at her thin dress, clawed at her legs as she moved deeper. But she pressed forward with grim determination. Moss-slick stones shifted beneath her feet, and twice she slipped, nearly falling beneath the surface. But she reached the girl. Up close, the injuries were worse. The child's leg was badly swollen, the skin an angry, mottled purple, and her arms were scratched and bleeding from dragging herself through brush. Her lips trembled as she spoke in a language Clementine didn't understand, her voice full of fear and urgency. But the gratitude in her eyes needed no translation. With effort, Clementine helped her toward the shallows on her side of the river. It was slow, grueling work. She had to half carry, half drag the other girl up the muddy bank. The climb toward the cabin took everything they had left. When they reached the door, both were drenched, shivering, and exhausted. Inside, Clementine worked by firelight. Her grandmother had left behind a small box of medical supplies, rags, herbs, a spool of thread, a few bottles of tincture. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She cleaned the girl's wounds, wrapped the deeper gashes, and fashioned a splint from kindling and an old strip of curtain. The girl clenched her jaw during the entire ordeal, her face tight with pain, only crying out once when Clementine reset the broken bone. Later, as night fell thick around the lonely cabin, the girls huddled beside the fire. Clementine shared what little food she had: stale cornbread and a handful of wild berries. The girl's fever broke just before midnight, and the color began returning to her cheeks. When Clementine pointed to herself and said her name, the other girl finally whispered her own, Ayanna. They didn't speak the same language, but it didn't matter. In that quiet room, lit only by fire and stars, they spoke in kindness, in shared glances and small gestures, the way children do when there are no adults to tell them what should divide them. But Clementine had no way of knowing who Ayanna truly was. No way of knowing that Ayanna was the daughter of Chief Running Bear, leader of the strongest tribal nation in the territory, and no way of knowing that 30 of his most elite warriors had been riding hard, tracking her trail, and that it now led directly to the edge of Clementine's world. At dawn, she was woken not by birdsong or sunlight, but by the sound of hoof beats, dozens of them thudding against the ground like distant thunder. She sat up fast, her heart slamming inside her chest. Through the gaps in the cabin's walls, she saw them, riders, circling the clearing like ghosts, painted faces grave and unreadable. Spears glinted in the first light. Feathers swayed in the breeze. The circle was perfect. No way in, no way out. Ayanna stirred on the bed when she heard the cadence of horses, the shape of the voices outside. Her expression transformed. Relief lit her fever-weakened face, and she tried to sit up, calling out in her native tongue words that sounded like joy to Clementine's ears, even if she didn't know their meaning. But the warriors outside didn't answer with celebration. Their voices were clipped, serious, orders were barked, weapons were readied. Then came the sound of boots crunching toward the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps, not charging, not aggressive, but each one heavier than the last. Ayanna reached for Clementine's hand, her grip unexpectedly firm. She spoke quickly, pointing to herself, then the door, then back again. She would speak. For her, she would explain. But would they believe her? Would they understand what Clementine had done? The knock that came wasn't violent, it was strong. Yes, but measured. 3 sharp raps that echoed like a judge's gavel. Clementine's hand trembled as she reached for the latch. Her whole body felt too small, too breakable, against whatever waited on the other side. She opened the door. And there he stood. Chief running bear filled the doorway, his massive frame blotting out the morning light. He stood nearly 7 feet, tall, with braided hair streaked with gray, and a face carved by both wisdom and war. Painted markings adorned his skin, symbols of leadership, protection, mourning. His eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, scanned the room in one long, silent sweep. But when they landed on Ayanna, everything in him changed. He spoke a single word, gentle, awed, something that might have been her name. Ayanna answered with a rapid flurry of words, her voice urgent, explaining everything with fevered breath and waving hands. She pointed to Clementine, to the supplies still scattered on the table, to the bandaged wounds, to the bowl that had once held food. Clementine stayed, frozen in the doorway, barely tall enough to reach the chief's chest. Behind him, more warriors approached, their eyes flicking across the cabin's interior, taking in every detail with solemn precision. But none moved forward, not yet. They waited, silent and tense, as Ayanna's voice wove the story. And then, Ayanna began to act it out. She showed how she had fallen into the river, how she had cried for help. She mimicked Clementine's daring approach, her rescue. She lifted her splinted leg, grimacing as she demonstrated how the white girl had cared for her like a sister. At times, her voice cracked with emotion, but she didn't stop. Chief running bear listened to every word. His expression shifted from fierce command to something softer, something humbled. When Ayanna finished, silence settled like snowfall. And then the impossible happened. The chief stepped forward, dropped to one knee before Clementine, and looked her directly in the eyes. In low, careful English, he said, "You saved my heart." He pressed his broad hand to his chest, then gestured toward Ayanna. "My daughter, my heart, you save." The warriors behind him murmured. Shock rippled through their ranks. Their chief, a man known never to bow, never to soften before settlers, was kneeling before a white child. But he wasn't finished. What he said next would echo beyond that moment, beyond the cabin and the river and the blood-stained history. Between their peoples, it would ripple through generations, the way stories do when they're forged in truth and courage. That morning, as two girls, one wild-haired and white, the other painted with the bloodline of warriors, stood together. In the doorway of a broken cabin, a new story began, not of war, not of fear, but of a kindness so pure it bent the path of history. Chief Running Bear reached into a worn leather pouch at his side, and when his hand emerged, every warrior around him audibly gasped. In his grasp was something ancient, powerful, a medallion carved from sacred stone, strung on a cord of braided horsehair that glinted faintly in the morning light. Clementine had never seen anything like it. The intricate markings etched into its smooth surface looked almost alive, like they were whispering an old story, one of protection, lineage, and sacred promise. "This," the chief said slowly, the words shaped with reverence, "belong my father, his father, and his father many before." His English came haltingly, each word weighted with ceremonial purpose. "Only give to blood, to family." Ayanna's eyes widened in disbelief. She spoke rapidly to her father in their language, her voice colored with protest, confusion, something urgent and emotional. But Chief Running Bear lifted his hand for silence. His gaze returned to Clementine. Steady and calm, as unshakable as a mountain. "You have no family," he said quietly. "We have no daughter like you. But heart knows truth. Spirit knows kindness." His eyes searched hers, looking not just at the child but into the depths of her loneliness, her courage, the quiet ache she tried to hide. "You are sister to Ayanna now, daughter to Running Bear." Then, with hands strong yet gentle, he placed the medallion around Clementine's neck. It settled against her chest like it had always belonged there. The stone felt warm against her skin, almost pulsing with quiet life. Something in the air shifted, subtle but undeniable. The warriors who had once encircled her with suspicion now looked at her with a quiet reverence, the kind reserved for sacred things. But the chief was not yet finished. "Alone is danger," he said, his deep voice brushing the cabin walls like distant thunder. He gestured toward the solitary home, its sagging roof and weathered door. "Winter comes, no help, no protection, not safe." He straightened to his full height, his presence again commanding, though the offer that followed softened the edges of his voice. "You come with us. Learn our ways. Ayanna, learn your ways." Both daughters now, Clementine's breath caught. The weight of the moment crashed through her like a wave. Everything she had ever known, this little cabin, the quiet bend in the river, her grandmother's memory folded into every creaking floorboard, was being laid down before something vast and unfamiliar. A new world, one where she would be the outsider, a place where even the language was foreign. She glanced down at the fire-blackened hearth, at the chair where her grandmother used to sit and hum softly in the evenings, at the rough wooden table where she had once traced letters with a dull pencil. Could she leave this behind? Could she step into something so completely unknown? Ayanna seemed to sense the storm within her. With effort, she stood and took Clementine's hand, her grip small but unshaking. "Come, sister," she whispered, blending English with her own tongue. "Safe, warm, family." That word family landed like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples through Clementine's chest. Since her grandmother's death, she hadn't belonged to anyone, not truly. She had spoken to the wind, to the trees, to ghosts of memory in the silence. Now, for the first time, someone was offering her something more than survival. A place, a bond, a name whispered with affection. But even as warmth stirred inside her, doubt crept in like a shadow. Would the others accept her? Would she always remain the white girl on the edge of the village, tolerated but never embraced? What if she couldn't learn their ways? What if she never stopped feeling alone? The chief seemed to understand her hesitation. "No, choose now," he said gently. "Time to think." But he swept his gaze around the small cabin, at the stacked firewood, the worn boots by the door, the signs of a child barely surviving. His voice deepened. "We not wait for danger." As if summoned by the very word, a cold wind slid through the door behind them, sharp and clean, carrying with it the scent of snow from the mountains. Clementine shivered. She remembered how brutal the last winter had been. Even with her grandmother's strength beside her, this year, she'd be alone. The chief stepped back, giving her space, but then his voice dropped, and it carried something far colder than the wind. "Other danger comes soon. Soldiers, look for Ayanna's trail. They find track to cabin." Her breath caught. Soldiers. The word itself was a threat. She had heard the whispers, the stories traded in the nearest town, how cavalry patrols roamed the frontier, treating any settler seen with native folk as a traitor. If they came here and found signs of Ayanna, they wouldn't ask questions. They wouldn't see what had really happened. They'd see betrayal, and Clementine would be punished for it. "How long?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. One of the warriors stepped forward and spoke rapidly to the chief. Running Bear's expression darkened. He looked toward the hills, then back to her, urgency flashing across his face. "Sun high," he said, "maybe sooner." The river that had nearly drowned Ayanna now roared inside Clementine's chest. Stay here and face soldiers who might accuse her of harboring the enemy, or leave behind everything she knew and take the hand of a stranger who had called her sister. Ayanna gently squeezed her hand and, despite the pain in her leg, limped toward the only possessions Clementine had in the world, her grandmother's hand-stitched quilt, a carved wooden doll, a few beloved books, and a small tin box holding a wedding ring and pressed flowers. Ayanna knelt with care and began gathering them, murmuring softly to her father as she worked. Running Bear nodded, then gestured to two of his warriors. They stepped forward, kneeling to help pack Clementine's things with a surprising tenderness. Not a word was spoken as they folded the quilt with reverence, tucked the books into leather bags, and wrapped the doll like a treasure. "You bring grandmother's spirit," the chief said, watching. "Honor ancestors. We understand this," even as relief swelled in her chest at his kindness. A new fear took hold. "What if I can't learn your ways?" Clementine asked quietly. "What if I don't belong?" For the first time since he had arrived, Chief Running Bear smiled. It was not wide, but it changed his face entirely. "Ayanna could not walk river alone," he said. "You teach her strength, she teach you belonging." Both learned together. Then, from the distant ridgeline, the low thunder of hoofbeats broke the stillness. They were still far, but approaching. Soldiers. The warriors snapped to readiness. Hands slid toward weapons, backs straightened. The chief's smile vanished. His voice dropped into a sharp, decisive tone. "Time to choose is now." Clementine looked around the cabin one final time. The table where her grandmother had taught her to read by candlelight. The hearth where they'd warmed their feet on winter nights. The cot where she had cried herself to sleep more nights than she could count. She closed her eyes, then turned to Ayanna, to Running Bear. To the warriors who now waited with silent patience. Her fingers brushed the medallion at her chest. Warm and solid, heavy with meaning. "I'm ready," she said. The moment the words left her lips, the warriors moved. Her few belongings were quickly secured onto a painted pony. A mare was led forward, calm, strong, with eyes as gentle as still water. Running Bear lifted Clementine onto its back like she weighed no more than a feather. Then he turned and lifted Ayanna behind her, cradling his daughter as though she were made of glass. "Hold tight to sister," he said, adjusting the reins into Clementine's hands. "She keep you safe on horse, you keep her safe in heart." As the war party prepared to move, Clementine took one last look at the only home she'd ever known. The morning sun had begun to spill across the cabin's timbers, turning the old wood gold, and in that golden light, she could almost imagine her grandmother standing in the doorway, a soft smile on her weathered face, nodding her blessing. Then the warriors moved out silent as ghosts, weaving through the trees like wind. They rode along hidden trails, careful and swift, their formation tight and protective. Scouts ranged ahead, eyes always watching. Running Bear kept close, his presence like a wall against the world. But it was Ayanna, tired, bruised, splinted, and strong, who became Clementine's anchor, with her arms wrapped tight around her waist, her voice sometimes humming soft melodies in their language. She made Clementine feel, if not yet safe, then no longer alone. Despite the pain in her leg, Ayanna rode steadily behind Clementine, her presence calm and constant. She offered soft encouragement whenever the younger girl faltered, her voice quiet but grounding. With a hand on Clementine's shoulder, she pointed out the ancient marks of her people's world: a massive eagle's nest nestled in the crook of a towering pine, a silver ribbon of waterfall singing its way down jagged stone, a golden meadow where wild horses grazed as if untouched. "By time, my people," Ayanna said gently, her English slow and deliberate, "have traveled these paths many seasons, safe paths, protected paths." And as they wound deeper into the vast wilderness, Clementine began to feel it, the shift. She was stepping out of the world she'd known and into one older, wiser, carved by memory rather than maps. This was no empty frontier. This land breathed with knowledge. Every stream had a name, every trail had a story. Every herb growing from rocky soil had once been gathered by hands that understood its power. When the sun stood high, they crested a ridge, and Clementine gasped. Below them stretched a hidden valley, so breathtaking she nearly forgot how to breathe. A clear river wound through grasslands that shimmered in the sunlight, and scattered along its banks were dozens of teepees, their painted hides glowing with meaning. Smoke curled peacefully from cooking fires. Women knelt in quiet focus, working. beads into elaborate patterns. Children chased each other near the water's edge, laughter drifting up like song. Men moved among the horses, their gestures fluid and reverent, like they were dancing with the animals. "Home," Ayanna whispered, and in that single word, Clementine heard a depth of longing and relief that pierced her heart. As they began the descent, she noticed the village below had gone still. Conversations stopped. Chores were abandoned. Faces turned upward, watching them approach. Word of the white child had clearly spread, and now every eye was filled with something: curiosity, confusion, wariness. A group of elder women began speaking rapidly among themselves, fingers motioning toward Clementine with a mix of concern and contemplation. Chief Running Bear, regal atop his horse, rode ahead to speak with the gathered leaders near the largest teepee. Their discussion was short, but laced with tension. Sharp glances flicked toward Clementine as words she didn't understand passed between them. The cadence taut like a pulled bowstring. Finally, the chief returned and offered a hand to help both girls dismount. Round them, the village had formed a wide circle, an unspoken council of eyes and silence. "My people must hear the story," Running Bear said gravely. "Must understand why white child wears sacred medallion. Must decide if village accepts new daughter." Clementine's heart pounded against her ribs. The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. This was more than ceremony, it was judgment. Her place in this world, and maybe Ayanna's safety too, hung in the balance. Chief Running Bear stepped into the center of the circle and spoke with the calm authority of a man accustomed to carrying history in his voice. He told of his daughter's disappearance, of the white child who had found her, who had offered protection instead of fear. He spoke of how, in a time of division, this single act of bravery had stretched across the gap between two worlds. Ayanna stepped forward, limping but unflinching. Her voice, though young, rang clear as mountain air. She told them what Clementine had done, how she'd pulled her from the river, dried her tears, and stayed by her side. Without asking for anything in return, she spoke of gentleness, of friendship, blooming in a place where mistrust had always lived. From the front of the circle, an elder woman with hair like river frost raised her hand. Her lined face held the weight of decades, and when she spoke, the crowd fell into respectful silence. Her voice was slow and thoughtful, shaped by years of knowing what to say and when to say it. A discussion followed, careful and deliberate. Some spoke with hesitation. These were dangerous times, they said. Bringing in a white child might stir the wrong kind of attention. Others spoke of old laws, of the sacred bond, formed when kindness was freely given, of the duty to return what had been offered tenfold. But it wasn't the voice of an elder that changed everything. It was a boy small, no more than 6, with wide, solemn eyes, who stepped quietly from the crowd. He walked straight to Clementine, fearless in his innocence, and said something in his native tongue that made the air go still. Chief Running Bear's voice shook slightly when he translated. He says, "She has the same sad eyes as me. When my mother went to the spirits," he says, "sad children should not be alone." A hush settled over the people. The elder woman stepped forward, again, this time reaching out. Her hand rested gently on the sacred medallion hanging over Clementine's chest. She studied it, then lifted her gaze to meet Clementine's with something deep and knowing behind her eyes. When she spoke, her voice was no longer questioning, it was warm, certain, final. Chief Running Bear smiled softly as he relayed her words. "Grandmother Singing Bird says, the spirits sent you to save Ayanna because they knew we needed to save you too. She says a child brave enough to save a stranger is a child worthy of our protection." The circle erupted not in chaos, but in a gentle, joyful swell. Women came forward offering food, soft moccasins, a cloak woven with care. Children crept closer, their shy gazes filled with curiosity that soon turned to smiles. Men offered nods of respect. The firelight of community had been lit, and Clementine, once an outsider, now stood at its center. As the sky softened with the colors of dusk, she found herself seated beside a fire, Ayanna leaning against her. Both of them wrapped in the hush of a home neither had expected to find. Laughter echoed across the valley, The scent of herbs and roasted corn drifted on the wind. The medallion on her chest caught the flicker of firelight and glowed like a promise. She understood it now. It wasn't just a symbol of honor. It was a vow, a belonging. The little cabin by the river seemed like something from another life here, in this sacred place where kindness had opened the door between two worlds. Clementine had found more than safety. She had found family. And beneath the sweep of stars overhead, she whispered a silent prayer of thanks to her grandmother's spirit, knowing now that the smallest act of compassion could spark a journey beyond imagination, and that sometimes the truest adventures begin with a heart willing to be kind.